I believe that when it comes to games based on an IP originated in another medium, what's most important for them is to feel like part of that IP. Clunky gameplay, a story that's only serviceable, unpolished animations, and whatever other issues the title might have, all those can be forgiven or simply overlooked should you stay immersed in this other world you know and love. That's the main source of one's enjoyment. And it is precisely the case with 2003's Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb, developed by the Collective and published by LucasArts. I won't beat around the bush. Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb could use some more time in the oven, but it's a game that really feels like it's indeed a part of the Indiana Jones universe. Well, most of the time. Well, where it can really make an impression, starting from the experience of opening the box. The game's cover fits right in with the posters of the movies. And then there's the manual. 2003 is a sort of transitional period when manuals are still a requirement, but they become increasingly more useless and forgotten since technology got advanced enough that there's nothing blocking from putting neither backstories nor teaching gameplay mechanics into the game proper. That's why it's so awesome that there were still games like Emperor's Tomb that cared enough about manuals to transform them into a part of the overall immersive package, being formatted in the style of Indie's field journal. It feels pretty great to spend a bit of time reading it before launching the game proper. Now, Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb has been released on 3 main platforms: PC, Xbox, and PlayStation 2. The footage you're going to see is from the original Xbox version. The Xbox version actually has increased resolution and widescreen support when played on the current generation Microsoft console models with backwards compatibility, but we are going full old school. With all this out of the way, let's delve into the Emperor's Tomb. Traditional action-adventure games usually introduce almost every element of the core principles you will be following fairly early on, and then variety is achieved through more external means. Level design, enemies, weapons, puzzles, stuff like that. Emperor's Tomb is no exception, and its Ceylon levels are a great mix of Indiana Jones stories traditionally starting in the middle of an already ongoing adventure, in this case the search for the idol of Kuruwatu, with a tutorial introduction that's going to teach pretty much all the mechanics related to the game's core pillars of platforming, combat, and exploration/puzzle solving. The latter two are not prominent enough to each form a pillar of their own, but together they do fulfill a goal of varying the pacing between the much more actiony segments. These are pretty traditional pillars, are they not? What, besides the actual character on screen, makes the Emperor's Tomb a distinctly Indiana Jones game? Well, the most prominently used pillar, combat, or rather 3 of its properties: improvisation, crunchiness, and the hat. I know, sounds weird, but let's elaborate, starting with improvisation. There is a particular ammo deficit in the game, which really boils down to one simple aspect. You never really have enough bullets to defeat all enemies in a combat scenario from afar, not unless you stockpile ammo without using it for a while. Regardless, this means that you're pushed to close the distance and engage in melee combat. But you still remain outnumbered most of the time. If there is nothing in the vicinity, you can use your whip to maybe steal a weapon from the opponent to then use it against them. Or maybe you can just pick up one of many interactive objects lying around. That's improvisation. You want to try to use every tool at your disposal most effectively. Bottles, chairs, shovels. Throw an enemy against a table, pick up the table leg and hit them in the nuts. And this is where the crunchiness comes in. Fighting in this game is not what you'd call aesthetically pleasing. With the exception of some more fancy enemies, nobody is doing any flourishes, cool moves, acrobatics. You kick an enemy in the face while they're climbing the ladder and then shoot them while they're down. Grab an opponent by the neck and just smash their head against your fist. The game is T-rated, so the visuals are somewhat more clean than they are in the movies, but the combat is still relatively grounded and realistic. which means you can lose your hat sometimes. And picking up a hat after a fight is the most satisfying conclusion to an encounter one can think of, one that is so distinctly Indiana Jones. Indy literally generates his hat out of his ass after swimming, which is why that part is not what makes it feel so closely connected to the franchise. But after a brutal fight, if you don't pick up the hat, you will just continue the level hatless, and that feels wrong. It's a very small mechanic that literally has no bearing on gameplay, and it doesn't happen that often, but it's one of my most favorite aspects of the entire game. Look, you can have a relatively faithful recreation of Harrison Ford's face with an acceptable voice alike, you can have original music that feels straight out of the films, you can have beautiful vistas, but it's details like the hat that separate Emperor's Tomb from other action adventures that make you go, oh, this is so cool, even though the actual combat mechanics lack the polish to truly shine. Don't get me wrong, the basics are great. You have two melee attack moves with a very flexible combo system that you can vary up either via pressing both buttons to grab or counter grab if necessary, throw opponents, and use environmental objects. It's everything a cool creative melee system really needs. But there are aspects that didn't get enough polish. For example, blocking. Sometimes it's possible to block in the middle of an enemy's combo, sometimes it's not. Dodging is a very cumbersome mechanic, which is annoying because more tricky enemies can do it with ease. And throwing is one of those things that the game itself doesn't teach well. I had to read the manual to understand how it works. While the enemy is grabbed, you have to specifically push the stick in the direction of the throw as a move. That's pretty uncomfortable because you naturally already hold the stick in the direction you're hitting or grabbing, and then you have to recenter it and push again to throw. I think it would work much better as a button. There is also a bunch of other clunky mechanics. There is no comfortable way to quickly go through your inventory, as you have to specifically press D-pad up to equip the item, otherwise it won't be. At least during exploration, there is a very handy feature that allows you to instantly equip the correct interaction item you need, but switching items mid-combat is going to remain cumbersome. The basics of shooting are fine, there's a pretty consistent auto-aim system. What's clunky is how you shoot out of cover. You have to manually approach the edge of the wall you're hugging and then push either the left or right analog trigger to hop out of it and take aim. The real issue here is the very finicky distance from which you can do this. You have to position yourself very precisely, otherwise Indy won't do anything at all, which sort of defeats the purpose of assigning the aiming out of cover to dedicated buttons. Hugging a wall does not make you immune to shots beyond the cover, meaning that if an enemy happens to see your elbow, they can hit you. It's not mandatory to have such an immunity, of course, but it is annoying in the context of you not being able to comfortably take positions for shooting out of cover. At least that works better than first-person aiming. And the latter is largely speaking useless anyway, except for the weird way stealth takedowns work. If enemies don't see you, shooting them in the head instantly kills them. This won't happen if they're alert. Weird. The problem is you can't move while aiming from first person, and constantly switching moves to get yourself into position will more often than not get you noticed. So honestly, you probably won't be doing any stealth takedowns, even in levels that are supposedly revolving around stealth, and we'll discuss those more later. There are similar issues of clunkiness with navigational mechanics. The basics of jumping, wall hugging, ledge catching, and so on are absolutely fine. Even swimming is pretty comfortable and consistent, and you know how easy it is to mess up swimming. And there seems to be a slight jump aim assist in place, so you wouldn't need to hold the movement stick in the absolutely exact direction necessary, and that's nice. But there too is clunkiness with varying degrees of annoyance. In some cases, like when Indy can't catch onto ledges with his feet during jumping, that's acceptable. But when Indy randomly refuses to catch ledges even with his hands, when at other times he totally does, now that can get really frustrating, especially considering how the game's checkpoint system works, in that there are no checkpoints. For what it's worth, the levels are relatively short, most of the time ranging between 5 to 10 minutes, but there are some outliers that can take up to 20. And that's precisely why, with obstacles that can kill you instantly from bottomless pits to giant man-eating crocodiles, yeah, from time to time you do wish for some checkpoints. And then there's just the generally uncomfortable controls for some particular navigational modes, like whenever you need to change direction or height while hanging on a rope, or the adventure mode. Look, I understand what this adventure mode that switches to more tile-based top-down gameplay tries to do, but there is just so many things wrong with time and responsiveness and what happens when you get hit, that every instance of adventure mode is almost a guaranteed reason to use medkits or drink from your canteen to replenish health, which by the way is a very atmospheric method of healing. But it's like the game itself doesn't like this adventure mode, because after Ceylon, with the exception of an instance right near the end of the game, you will never see it again. All future traps are avoided with traditional gameplay, and honestly it's much more reasonable that way. Unless it's rubble that falls down upon stepping on it, because once your foot is on that rubble, you can't jump anymore to avoid falling down. The one time that did luckily happen. And it's a shame that there's all these inconsistencies present in the core gameplay, because I have no big gripes against the Emperor's Tomb implementation of its last pillar that concerns exploration and puzzles. There are some questionable aspects from a thematic perspective, like why would one find modern wooden boxes with medkits in a secret area nobody has visited for centuries, or how come a portcullis with insanely huge gaps is impassable for indie? I mean, look at it! What kind of back problems Dr. Jones has after his adventures that he'd rather go through the trouble of swinging through chains and shit rather than just bending a bit? And I have to really question if Indiana Jones, who tries to bring everything to a museum, would actually destroy an ancient undiscovered statue of Poseidon to open up a hole in the ground. Why not just blow up the ground directly instead? But these are of course details that I can make fun of, but they really don't impede gameplay or enjoyment. Unlike the mechanical clunkiness, the frustration from which can sadly increase as you go through the adventure. The chances of mechanics messing things up for you only get bigger as the levels become more complex and elaborate. Ceylon is definitely a nice tutorial set of levels that teaches all the core mechanics, while providing a variety of situations with their own escalation, like how throwing skulls to distract crocodiles transforms into throwing skulls to trigger trap statues, and culminates with throwing skulls to lure away a giant albino crocodile that has settled near the idol. But the following area of Prague Castle is where the game proper really begins, and it's Emperor's Tomb at its finest. The game really understands how to control its pacing in levels, which is imperative for an adventure like this one. Pacing can be very difficult to get right because it's a very multi-layered beast. It starts with a high-level focus of any particular segment, which in Emperor's Tomb are very handily separated into levels. Prague starts with a platforming-focused level where we infiltrate the castle. Then we go through a more puzzle and trap-focused dungeon level, before emerging into a very combat-focused courtyard level. We then go into the Great Hall, which is just chock full of interactive elements that you can not only use in active combat, but also to do some cool stuff like dropping a chandelier on a bunch of Nazis. That's followed by a library exploration level with an increased aspect of verticality. And then we have a set of missions switching between an area with the astrologer's clock puzzle and various levels providing a mix of platforming and combat to find objects activating the next step of the puzzle. All this culminates with a boss battle against a Nazi experiment. The other layer is of course the more moment-to-moment pacing, the actions you're actually doing. The first level of Prague is platforming focused, sure, but you still fight a couple goons there and there, and the platforming has you vary between things like ledge shimmying, jumping and whip swinging. Seems to be pretty straightforward, the variety of buttons that you press. But then there's the context of the level. Any combat situation that you're gonna participate in is gonna feel different, whether it's an open area with enemies coming from all directions, a brawl in tight corridors without much space for moving around, or in a very decorated room where most objects can be destroyed and used to beat the shit out of your opponents. Then there's the little but special memorable moments that Indiana Jones drips in regular doses. Things like swinging through a stained glass window straight in a fight with Gestapo agents, strategically placing a liquor bottle for you to take so when you open the door to the balcony nearby, you could throw that bottle right at the Nazis standing there, causing them to fall to their death. This kind of stuff all adds to that Indiana Jones feel I was mentioning, even if only from an action perspective, but that's enough to immerse yourself into the world. All this is why the unpolished aspects of the core mechanics can be so frustrating. It's actually not that big of a problem in Ceylon or Prague, hence why these chapters are just such a pure fun ride, but later down the line the Emperor's Tomb will try to build upon all the aforementioned principles to create something even more original than before. More complex architecture, a more difficult set of swinging sections, trickier traps, collectibles hidden behind more dangerous jumps. And that's when the clunkiness we have already discussed really shows its ugly head. And the total lack of checkpoints doesn't help either. But at least all these segments are still going to be memorable for the right reasons, because the final touch that Emperor's Tomb implements within its spacing and level progression is choosing a stylistical focus for each of its chapters. You'll be doing gyrating acrobatics and escaping practically every gameplay chapter, but Prague, due to the verticality of its castle, is going to be full of them, and that's what you'll remember it for. Istanbul levels are not the only ones with swimming, but that's a particularly big focus there. Ascending the mountain chapter is not the only one where you'll have to shoot from a machine gun, but jumping between gondolas and defending against German planes is definitely what sets that one apart. Fighting spirits after crossing the portal to the world of the dead… wait, what? Underworld in an Indiana Jones game? Yeah, as good and varied the level design of the game is, I suppose it's time we talk about the story a bit. Istanbul is the first time we're going to encounter the most obvious representation of the game's most glaring issue with the story, the Kraken boss fight. It just happens. There's a giant Kraken sending jellyfish monsters at us. We defeat it. Indiana Jones doesn't comment a single thing. Not even a holy shit, it's a Kraken! After we have dealt with the monster, our ally suddenly appears like nothing has happened. Like we didn't just fight a freaking Kraken. And look, I know that the previous boss fight was some sort of weird Nazi experiment using the piece of the artifact we were searching for, but that at least has some sort of explanation, unlike the Kraken. Now, I'm not going to say that a Kraken doesn't inherently fit into an Indiana Jones story. Every Indiana Jones tale is, at the end of the day, about a skeptic finding truth in myth. But you know what? I think if a guy like Dr. Jones is to encounter a portal that leads them to the world of the dead, their reaction must be at least a bit stronger than a nonchalant "so the legends were true."
The legend is true after all.
I mean, come on, it's a portal to the underworld. And chronologically it happens before the events of the movies, and I know that Indiana Jones takes the validity of every myth on a case-by-case basis, but come on, after being attacked by a huge fucking mystical dragon, would he really be against the notion that the Ark of the Covenant actually exists? While we're at it, the Emperor's Tomb technically leads directly into the Temple of Doom movie, and the main connective tissue is Wuhan, which the game positions as the first meeting with him, while in the movie before dying he reminiscens about all adventures he had with Indy before.
I followed you on many adventures.
In the context of the Emperor's Tomb, that's a total of 1. But look, it's a nitpick in the grand scheme of things. The real problem with the narrative of Emperor's Tomb is that it's just a collection of Indiana Jones tropes. I can't even remember the name of the story's characters without googling them. At least Indy also seems to have this issue.
Look, Hans, or Klaus, or whatever your name is.
A villain suddenly appears to take away the treasure you found in the beginning section. Indy is hired to find some artifacts, and the employer is clearly someone who is actually an antagonist. Indy is captured and taken straight to the site of a Nazi excavation. Indy infiltrates a Nazi base to save a love interest who's been quite capable of fighting until the moment the gotta rescue her trope comes into play. Though she does turn into a demon for a boss battle. That's new, but also never mentioned again. Now, it's very clear that the Emperor's Tomb was planned to be a more detailed, elaborate story than it actually became in the end. When opening the gallery, which is unlocked after collecting all artifacts in the game, we can see the concept art of Abner Ravenwood, father of Marion Ravenwood from the first movie. But he's not in the story. Concept art shows some pictures of one Master Lao, who's also not in the story. I don't know what his deal is, but I would assume he was supposed to be a wise old man who'd have to help Indy get past his skepticism. Also a trope, sure, but an important one for the flow of the narrative. The absence of such connective tissues is clearly felt throughout. And the reason why I focus on the Kraken is because that's literally the moment when common sense leaves the game and you have to just accept everything that happens and enjoy the ride. The first 3 chapters flow fairly well. The idol of Kuruwatu found in Ceylon secretly holds the first piece of the artifact the Nazi want, which is said to control the will of man. We're hired to steal from the Nazis the second piece they already found and are holding in Prague, but are captured and brought to Istanbul for interrogation, which happens to be the excavation site where the Nazis are already searching for the third piece. And then the Kraken happens. And after, it's not gonna be just logical issues with the big jumping in the shark stuff either. There are smaller situations that make you laugh, wondering how that makes sense. Listen to this phrase.
Doesn't this thing go any faster?
Out of context seems fine, right? In context though, this thing is Wuhan himself who is driving the carriage, with his legs, while being chased by cars and motorcycles. Yeah. Though, as is quite obvious by the footage I guess, the Kraken has been a turning point not just for the story, but the quality of levels as well. Emperor's Tomb consists of 10 chapters, each representing a particular location. The first 3 chapters, Ceylon, Prague and Istanbul, have 29 levels combined, and it takes around 5 hours to go through all of them. The other 7 chapters also consist of 29 levels combined, and it takes around 5 hours to complete them. Now, of course, on its own this is not indicative of anything. There's nothing wrong with going through more locations at a faster pace in the second half of the story. However, in conjunction with other things we're going to discuss, it is pretty clear evidence that the latter 7 chapters of the game were rushed and received less attention than the first 3. For example, Hong Kong starts with a couple nice levels at the Golden Lotus Opera House. They're mostly focused on melee combat with a lot of interactable objects, but you complete both of them in around 15 minutes tops and get to that street chase which, well, it's not great, but both stages dedicated to it will be done in 5 minutes. And that's it, you're out of Hong Kong. Time for the next locale. And then the game switches through locations just like that. You never really get to indulge in a specific chapter's gimmick like you could with the first 3. So the level where you pose as a Nazi after stealing their uniform? That's a cool concept, but there's only one level of that. In the next, your cover is blown, so Indy ditches the uniform in the third. On the other hand, this means that any far less cooler sections are also over quick. For example, the segments with stealth. Aren't stealth levels in a game with practically no stealth mechanics great? You can stay in a place where you think you're hidden, but someone from very far away still notices you and turns on an alarm, so you have to find a lever to turn it off and to deal with the flamethrower troopers that have appeared. And the stealth takedown headshots are really useless here. You're better just running through these levels, killing everyone as fast as possible actually, because then the chances of someone triggering an alarm are smaller. And I just want to make it clear, my criticism does not lie with the design of even these kinds of levels, which is still good and follows to great effect the principles I have outlined earlier on, but the quality of implementation is often lacking for one reason or another. This rushed state has affected other aspects too, even transitions between levels. For example, at the end of one chapter you enter a mountain tunnel while riding a gondola. At the beginning of the next one, you'll be standing with absolutely zero comments from Indy's side once again, next to a huge ancient-looking Chinese castle spawning next to a big door. No sign of gondola lines or anything. Cutscene visuals also greatly decrease in quality in this second half of the game. Now, Emperor's Tomb always looks great during gameplay, so at least there's that. You will regularly be met with beautiful vistas, detailed environments, all adding to the cinematic nature of gameplay, the feeling of which is enhanced even further through character animations. Cutscenes though, even at their best in the first half, are a bit clunky. Characters are somewhat stiff, camera work is pretty basic but at least sensible. But in the second half, the cutscenes just gradually become more haphazardly put. Even more stiffness, static shots with faces right in your, well, face, culminating in cutscenes that have supposedly intense moments but feel half-finished with missing sound effects, assets, and unpolished animations. The enemy design gets more boring too. The first half of the game might have had an issue of being full of enemies consisting of, for the most part, 1 or 2 models per area, but at the very least, thanks to the variety of weapons they could use, as well as environmental object placement, every encounter with them felt different. This lasts up until the last third of the game, where enemies will just feel extremely samey. There's barely any variety with how you deal with the Chinese spearmen all over the castle, or the zombies, or the ghosts. Combat really starts feeling by the numbers. So in that sense, I guess that's another advantage of the game ending pretty soon after. The last cutscenes are really representative of the final impressions of Emperor's Tomb. After the main villain is defeated in the underworld, the screen cuts to black. The next scene happens in the Golden Lotus Opera House, where Indy and his resident love interest for their story Mei Ying tell Wuhan how they barely escaped before everything collapsed. Sure sounds like it would have been exciting to play, and then the game ends with some cheeky direct references to the Temple of Doom. It's over, and I couldn't help but be left with a conflicted feeling between, well, that was fun, and wait, that's it? It sure has been an adventure, but was it a satisfying one? And the best way to answer that last question, I suppose, is with a score based on my Stasocritic rating system. It's a set of 5 different categories, each having their own weight, and 11 different possible scores with their own criteria. The first category is design. It has the largest weight of 4 because at the end of the day, what really defines the quality of a game is how well it is made and plays. And look, I know I could have sounded pretty damning in that last segment of mine, but make no mistake, Emperor's Tomb is a well-designed game. The core mechanics are great, it's just there is a number of unpolished aspects. The level design is great, but the unpolished parts of the mechanics do tend to make particular parts of it frustrating. And even though some segments are underwhelming because the game was clearly rushed, they're still built upon a solid foundation, which is why I will assign a 7 to design. Based on design principles alone, if everything were perfect, it could have been easily a 9. But while overall the implementation is solid, a certain number of aspects does bring it down. The next category is emotions. Now it has a weight of 3. Regardless of what a game's quality is, our enjoyment is not necessarily derived from that. We can love flawed games and be bored from well-made ones. Now, when it comes to the Emperor's Tomb, the first 5 hours were an absolute blast. Yeah, the adventure mode part in Ceylon was eh. Istanbul had some pretty tricky jumps that the ledge detection system wasn't prepared to consistently deal with, but it still was very fun throughout. After Istanbul though, every so often I would rage quit. But here's the thing, I still had an itch to play out of my own volition. I was hooked. So I'd go back, be more careful, with the knowledge of the past issues successfully complete that annoying level, and then have fun again. Until the next time the situation would happen. Rinse and repeat. I would say in the last 7 chapters, meaning the second half of the game, I had about 5 rage quits. But I still got back and overall enjoyed Emperor's Tomb, though I would really prefer not to have those rage quits, so innate for emotions it is. In retrospect, I remember playing this game as a kid and liking it a lot, but now I understand why I don't remember ever finishing it. Then we have cohesion. This category has a weight of 2 and it focuses on how well all the different aspects of a game are connected together. Now, so you would understand my scoring process, I don't wait until I'm done with the game, either by finishing it or having enough and dropping it, to give a score to all the categories. I actually do preliminary scoring based on my progress at the time, and then adjust as I go further. The reason I'm mentioning this is because the Emperor's Tomb started with cohesion rating of 8, and then I dropped it to 7, but it did not stay there. I dropped it to 6, and then it stayed there at 6. As already mentioned, the game just stops making sense at one point. But the feeling of playing an Indiana Jones title still persists. Mostly that's thanks to the mechanics that have a strong connection to the IP, but that's still enough to assign such a score. We continue with context. It has a weight of 1 since games can be fun even with bad context, which is not just the narrative, but everything contextualizing the experience, world building, player stories, and so on. Now, I've discussed the story aspects enough already, so I can say from the get-go that it's gonna get assigned a 5. The story starts solid if tropey and then devolves into whatever it becomes. But, again, there is still some fun writing, if maybe inappropriate for Indiana Jones like this.
Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China. Looks pretty good, all things considered. I don't think you'll be needing this.
And regardless of jumping the shark, the game still regularly puts us in enjoyable indie-style situations. So I don't think what happens deserves the scoring to go below this average number. There is enough to keep the game afloat in that regard. And the final category is aesthetics, also with a weight of 1 for similar reasons. Again, I have nothing to add to what I have already discussed. It's an 8. During gameplay, Emperor's Tomb looks consistently great throughout, even if sometimes weird situations happen. But those are far more forgivable than what is often met in the second half of the game, with its lack of polish in cutscenes, sound design, and even some parts of voice acting. What was that? So yeah, a solid 8. I didn't really discuss the music in detail, but I don't have to say much about it. Outside of the Indiana Jones main theme, all score is original to this game, and you wouldn't ever be able to say that's the case. That's how good it is and how well it fits. So, with all this said and done, the final Stasocritic rating of Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb is 70. It's a good game. Mind you, Stasocritic 70 is not the Metacritic 70, which tends to be viewed as mixed or average. No, thanks to the criteria, the actual average is at 50. 70 is good. I have no qualms with recommending the game to people who enjoy the genre or the brand. Honestly, I'd say Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb is severely underrated. It might not be an evenly great experience on a pure technical level, sure, and it might have jumped the gun several times when it comes to adherence to the IP, I'll give you that. But also, it feels ahead of its time, particularly with its combat system. Most importantly though, at the end of the day, it's still a fun ride. Yeah, Emperor's Tomb can be clunky, can be annoying, sometimes doesn't have any modicum of sense. But after all, isn't just being fun what ultimately Indiana Jones media is all about?